I'm Elizabeth Churchill, and I'm the Department Chair and a Professor of Human-Computer Interaction here at MBZUAI, the Mohammed bin Zayed University of Artificial Intelligence. And I am joined here, I'm delighted to be joined here by Professor Toby Walsh.
It's lovely to see you again after all these years.
After all these years. And I'm going to say a little bit about Professor Walsh. He's a Laureate Fellow and Scientia Professor of Artificial Intelligence at the Department of Computer Science and Engineering at the University of New South Wales. He's also a research group leader at Data 61, an adjunct professor at Queensland University of Technology, external professor of the Department of Information Science at Uppsala University, and an honorary fellow of the School of Informatics at Edinburgh University, and an associate member of the Australian Human Rights Institute of UNSW. I want to tell you all of those things because Toby is very, very accomplished, and we're so delighted to be talking to you. And Toby mentioned that it was nice to see each other again. Fun fact, Toby, when did we meet?
It would have been very early 90s.
Very early 90s.
And we wrote together, actually, a small journal article, one of the first journal articles I wrote with anyone.
Yes.
I was a young student at the time, PhD student at the time.
Me too. Yeah, we were very inspired. And
yes.
We talked about the notion of scruffy and neat, which was a particular phrase that was used at that phase of AI. So what do you think has changed since then? A lot has, but what are the top things that, you think, are we beyond scruffy and neat? Are we into a new world?
Well, it's interesting to think that scruffy described those people who are building systems and did it in a rather haphazard way, and neat were those people who proved theorems about what they were doing. And we still have that division within artificial intelligence today. And we still worry about some of those issues about reproducibility, about, we were looking at whether people bother to write down a hypothesis in a scientific way, whether and you still, there's always that tension in artificial intelligence, which is there's an engineering part of it, which is you're trying to build systems and build them in robust ways and scale them. And then there's the science side of it. We're trying to understand the nature of intelligence and how that might be embodied into machines. And there's always been that tension in the field between the somewhat scruffy people who are just interested in building stuff that might work, and the neater people who want to actually understand the equations and the science behind it. And we're always trying to balance those tensions.
And of course, you alluded also to the sort of philosophy around what is intelligence. So there's the sort of neat algorithmic, but then there's also the implications around how we're replicating or amplifying how humans think. So do you think there's been a big shift in the philosophy of AI around replicating or augmenting human thinking?
Well, certainly foundation models, large language models. Now people talk about growing intelligence. They talk about there's a very limited understanding of how those systems work, and therefore their limitations and how they break. And it does worry me a little bit as those systems get put in increasingly important places, that they're very unpredictable because there is very little science behind it.
And very little transparency. This is something that you have written about. You've written many books, and I love your books because they take very deep technical ideas and make them accessible to a general audience, reflecting the deep science, but bringing up questions that we can, as less expert people, engage with. So in terms of transparency, where do you think we're going? What do you think we can do?
Well, the lack of transparency is partly a deliberate commercial decision that, for example, the language models are ingesting vast amounts of copyrighted material. My books are being ingested into tens of thousands of authors' books are being ingested into them. And the companies don't want to be very transparent about that because that's opening them to to a bunch of class action suits that they will have to face. I think it's absolutely outrageous what they're doing, which is, I wrote a piece for one of the leading Australian newspapers, and the title of the piece, I thought at the time, it was a bit melodramatic. I called it "The Greatest Heist in Human History." Because not only is it all that cultural knowledge that's in our literature, it's all our geographical knowledge, all our economic knowledge, all those memes of social media. It's absolutely everything about our society that's being ingested at no cost. They're not getting any consent or compensation to the people for doing that. I think the best way to compare it is to what we saw with music.
Mm-hmm.
If we go back to Napster in the noughties, when we started streaming music, to begin with, it was all stolen. And that, people were excited that the music was suddenly available everywhere and anywhere. But that wasn't sustainable. There was no way that artists, musicians could continue to produce music if we just stole all of their content. And eventually Napster went out of business. And we've morphed now into the streaming model, where you've got services like Spotify and Apple Music, where people are paying a subscription, and some of that revenue is going back to the artists. Now, I'm not sure that it's necessarily in a fully sustainable place yet. If you're Taylor Swift, you're getting plentiful money out of that. But if you're a jobbing artist, I'm not sure that the pennies you're getting for the streaming content is actually keeping you in business. But we're getting towards what's a much more sustainable business. But I think we're going to have to do something like that with all the intellectual property that's going into these foundation models, whether it be authors' books or graphic designers' art, because that cultural knowledge is essential to our society. One of the things that society has that we value much is that cultural knowledge, and if it's just all taken by the tech companies and then sold on, what will happen to our culture? Which is one of the things that makes life worth living.
I think I have I'm an optimist by nature, and I am optimistic that our artists can use the tools that AI is bringing to create new things, as well as I hope that as a society we can engage with what you're saying, which is to help give artists something back so that they can have the remuneration to be able to do some of these new artistic things. What are the things you're excited about in the art space that we could engage creative people in different ways to amplify?
You're right. These are tools that allow people to be potentially much more creative. I'm not a particularly good artist. My draftsmanship skills are not very great. But with these generative AI tools, I can suddenly make things that really are quite impressive. I'm not a very good musician, but suddenly with these generative AI tools, I can start making music to a much greater extent. Now, that doesn't mean that that's great music necessarily, right? But artists have always picked up whatever technology it was. They said that photography was going to kill painting. And photography hasn't killed painting. Painters now earn more money, inflation adjusted, than they ever earned.
Mm-hmm.
The best paid painters earn way more than art has become much more expensive. And indeed, photography, there's a branch of photography, artistic photography, which has become an art form in itself. It has changed the way that we see the world and the way that art tries to represent that world, because we have this perfect way of representing it. But it hasn't actually detracted in many respects from mm-hmm. art. And so I think the hope is that AI will be the same. It's another tool that will allow us to do things, and it won't spoil the idea that humans need to labor over these things.
I remember photocopier art, and everybody said it's not really art. And there was this whole movement. It's not art because there was a tool involved of a particular kind. But that was a really big movement as another example of that kind of creativity. So I do think that, yes, that there will be opportunities like that. But again, I very much agree with you on the theft and the recognition that has to go back to those artists and what data we're taking and we're using wantonly. I think that is a big issue.
There's one bit of me that thinks that maybe we have to change the legal system to catch up with this. So copyright was invented when we invented printing. Suddenly you could reproduce. I mean, previously you had to write out by hand other people's books. It wasn't cheap, it wasn't easy or quick to copy people's books. And suddenly we could. And then to protect the intellectual property that those people and the effort that people put into those books, both the publishers and the authors, we invented copyright. Mm-hmm. And that's proved in, over hundreds of years to be a successful system to ensure that there's incentive for people to produce books and people to write those books. The thing that we can do now with these language models is that we can copy someone's style. Mm-hmm. And that falls outside the strict legal sense of copyright. It's not the exact words that appear in someone's book. But if I always worry that, if I put the 10,000 hours into, or Malcolm Gladwell has put the 10,000 hours into writing in the style of Malcolm Gladwell, or Ishigaru has put the 10,000 hours into writing in the style of Ishigaru, or in my own case, I put the 10,000 hours into writing my books, that can now be stolen by these tools, and you can write in the style of Ishigaru or Gladwell or Walsh or whoever it is that you want. Whether that is going to prevent people putting those 10,000 hours in and getting the recompense for that.
So in the style of, that's a very interesting phrase and concept, because your creativity is putting together things that may not have been put together before. You see connections where the rest of us don't, and that's why you produce these amazing books. But can AI have that creative leap to put things together? Because your style is your creative construction, not just your writing style.
Well, I mean, that's a wonderful question. And it's a question that has haunted the field from before it started. I mean, you can go all the way back to Ada Lovelace, working with Charles Babbage in the 18th century, the first computer programmer, a woman, who wrote the very first computer program. But also, and I think it's amazing how she, again, this is her creativity that we're now talking about still 300 some years later, which is, she mused upon what those machines could do. And it's worth putting that in the context of what Babbage and people like Babbage were trying to do. Babbage was trying to recreate the artillery tables and the navigation tables and the astronomy tables, vast tables, and they would have errors put into them because they were drawn up by hand. And he thought, well, I'll build a mechanical computer, it's going to be at the time, to do those things. But Ada realized that those numbers didn't have to be numbers in an artillery table, angles of inflection and coordinates of stars. Those could be musical notes or letters and words or dots in a painting. And then, ask the question that still haunts us today, which is, well, are computers ever going to be creative, or are they just going to be following the instructions that they do? And as a scientist, I think I have to entertain the idea that machines could be creative, that at the end of the day, we're biological machines. And why, what's special about us? Well, we're very complex, interesting machines that have evolved over millions of years. But I don't see any fundamental reason why eventually, perhaps not today, but eventually we won't build machines that can do some of that. And there's already, some hints that we're going in that direction, that machines will create music that, will entertain you. It won't necessarily be the Beatles or Bach, But we're already starting to get machines make music. We're already get machines starting to make paintings. Machines making bad poetry, not particularly good poetry yet. But so on the functional level, I can see it happening. But on a human level, I don't actually see it happening, because great art speaks to those human experiences, falling in love, losing a loved one, contemplating your mortality. Those are human experiences. A machine is never going to fall in love. It doesn't have the right chemistry to do that. A machine is never going to have to contemplate its mortality because it's immortal. It's never going to, have a finite life like we are going to. It's never going to lose a loved one. It's never going to have that rich emotional life that we have as humans, which is both pleasure and pain. So that those questions around the human condition that great art always speaks to, machines can produce things that talk about those questions, but I don't think they'll ever mean so much to us, because think, well, what do you know about falling in love? You've never had your heart broken like I've had my heart broken. You've never had to deal with the fact that someone close to you has died. So I think in that sense, artists are not ever going to be replaced. That they'll have these tools that will allow them to do things that they couldn't otherwise do. But equally, the stuff that AI makes won't ever quite speak to us. It will entertain us. You'll get your airport pot boiler. We'll be entertained to death, perhaps, and that's something to worry about. But I don't think it will ever really speak to us like the great art does.
Yeah, it's very interesting, because as more and more is produced, I think you gave great examples when you're listening to AI-generated music. A lot of the novels that came out and children's books that came out, compelling at the beginning, but there's that moment which has been called the uncanny, when you think you're talking to or reading or ingesting something from another person. And that also goes back to early AI, of course, when with Eliza, people would believe they were talking to a therapist. Yes. And they were typing in all of their secrets. And we see that modern versions of that happening. But there's that very human ability to notice something's wrong, to notice repetition, to notice there isn't that next creative step, which I think is fascinating, because I don't know that an AI could notice that there is something uncanny about something produced by another AI, unless it was reflecting itself, I guess.
And then it's thinking out of the box. So, these tools now, the generative AI tools, are very good at reproducing someone's style. But, what was it that made Picasso the fantastic painter he was? One of the greatest painters of the 20th century, was because he kept on recreating his style, and he saw ways to see the world in which no one had ever seen the world, to change the perspective of how we saw the world. That wasn't a copy of anyone else's style. That was just a new way of seeing the world. So in that sense, I think humans again have a natural advantage. I remember there was the latest Beatles song came out, so they used AI to lift John Lennon's voice out of a very crappy tape recording of a demo tape, and then some of the other Beatles, and I think it was the John Lennon's son, because sadly, of course, Lennon is not with us anymore, who made it. I remember being interviewed on the TV about this, about the latest, and they said they called it the final Beatles song, and I said, well, of course, this isn't the final Beatles song. We're going to you can be able to have infinite amounts of Beatles songs. Because you'll be able to generate anything in the style with the same voices. But the Beatles canon is a finite set of songs that were produced in those magical few years where the Beatles were still together. And whilst you'll be able to get music perhaps that is as satisfactory from a musical sense as the original Beatles songs, it will only be those songs that the Beatles made that were a special time in history, that they get their speciality because they are a small limited number, and the Beatles split up at that. But that was it. You had to be there.
Right, right. So I want to change tack a little bit, and I want to take a little bit of a selfish move. So my area of expertise is human-computer interaction, human computation interaction. And it's everything from the devices in our pockets to thinking about brain-computer interaction to thinking about some of the new models that are coming out, like neuromorphic models, simulating the brain, simulating the human brain and trying to model that in different ways, beyond the early dreams of neural nets into what's the next phase of that. So my selfish question is, what do you think is going to change in the way that we interact with AI? It's not just personalization on your personal devices. It's going to be not just brain-computer interfaces, but what do you think are the next interaction modalities that we might experience?
Well, I do see AI as being sort of the operating system of all our devices. So if you think about it, everything, I mean, not just our smartphones and our computers and our smartwatches, but our glasses, our front doors, our toasters, our cars, everything is being networked together. And there's lots of advantage, right? Everything talks to everything else. Everything is going to be that much smarter, whatever that means. And most of those devices don't have keyboards as input. Many of those devices don't have screens as output. So how are we going to interact with them? Well, the obvious thing to do is we're going to talk to them and they're going to talk back to us. And so immediately you're in the world of AI, because to understand speech recognition, and then to make sense of what that text, what that language is saying, and do stuff with that text requires AI. And then remembering the context, the person and their preferences, and what does that mean when Elizabeth says, what's in the fridge? Well, whose fridge is that? That's Elizabeth's fridge, right? What do I need to pick up from the shops on the way home? I need to check Elizabeth's fridge to find out what's still left in the fridge. So AI is going to be sprinkled on top of every electrical device. Mm-hmm. And it will be the way that we intermediate those experiences with those devices. And we'll make those devices more reactive, more responsive, and more rewarding. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, I think it's the future of everything electrical is AI.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think for me personally, the use of AI to support people of determination, people with disabilities and other abilities, there's a huge opportunity there for us as well.
Yeah, when you think about it, the things, if I've got a problem with hearing or I've got limited sight, what's the technology that's going to give me better hearing, better sight? It's AI. Computer vision, speech recognition is going to do those things for me, provide those substitutes, amplify those things for me. So yes, it's exactly the technology that will hopefully level the playing field. I mean, the problem there is that I don't think it happens if we just let the market decide. Why is it that you can get taxes if you're a disabled person? Well, it's because we made a rule. In most countries, we made it a rule that a certain percentage of taxes have to be there for disabled people, and they have to offer the same prices, and that's a tax that we all pay, that we're all happy to pay on the provision of taxes, but because it was made a law. And I do worry that we're going to have to insist that these services are available to people, whatever their abilities, because otherwise you'll appeal to the bigger market first and maybe never get round to the more disadvantaged groups.
What do you think we can do as everyday people to be involved in those governance conversations, in those demands for making certain things required? What can every person do to be part of that conversation?
It's a good question. Well, I think first of all, people have to realize that technology is not destiny. We get to build the technology that we want. And we also get to, introduce technology into parts of our lives where it's going to add to our lives, and we should choose not to introduce it in places where it's going to detract from our lives. And to realize that we get choices in that, and that, we make decisions, and it may seem that technology happens to us, But actually, it's a sequence of choices that we, our governments, and other people make that make those choices. And that's why I spend a lot of time writing the books, is because I think everyone should be involved in those conversations. This is technology that's going to touch everyone's lives. Therefore, everyone needs to be informed to make a good choice. If we sit on our hands, I think the outcome is one in which there will be a concentration of power into the tech giants' hands, and it won't necessarily be for everyone's benefit. If we push back and make sure that it is, then I'm quite an optimist in that sense.
So you have talked about and written about this notion of augmentation, and not just the augmented human, but augmented humanity, really sort of thinking about the bigger picture and having these conversations through, governments, through, whatever agency that you possibly can. And I think that's a sort of repeat message and an important one, which is good.
I hope one day that AI stops being artificial intelligence, becomes augmented intelligence.
Yes.
That we realize that there are some places where replacing people is good, where the dirty, dull, difficult, dangerous jobs, humans should never have done those in the first place, and we should celebrate when we get machines to do those dirty, dull, dangerous things now, because humans don't have to subjugate themselves to that. But there's most of the places, though, we want to amplify people. We want to augment their abilities. We don't want to replace them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think that goes again to an early phase of interactive technology, early phases of human computation, early phases of AI, with Doug Engelbart in 1962 writing the Manifesto of Augmented Humans, augmentation. And that is a philosophy that I really see, I know you've always had, and it comes through in your books a lot. Which brings me to the next question. What's your next book?
Well, it's called The Shortest History of AI.
Wonderful.
And it's a whistle-stop, high-level, amusing story about where AI came from. It's the funny thing is that, I think many people think AI has been an overnight success. And in some sense, it is an overnight success. Suddenly ChatGPT burst upon our shores, and everyone realized that artificial intelligence was arriving into their lives. Everyone got hyper excited, but forgetting that there's more than 50 years of research that's gone into that. People have been working on it since the 1950s, at least. It's as soon as we had, computers of any form, people started thinking, well, what can we do with these computers? How far can we push them? And started not realizing the great history and all the work that's gone into where we are today. So the subtitle of the book is 6 Ideas Are All You Need to Know. So it breaks the whole of AI down into 6 simple ideas. But I'll just tempt you with the opening of the book. I'll give you the first 3 sentences of the book, which is: artificial intelligence started on June the 18th, 1956. It was a Monday. June the 18th was, as you surely remember, is the first day of the famous Dartmouth Summer School, where first scientific meeting, where the founding fathers, unfortunately they were all men, of artificial intelligence got together. John McCarthy, Marvin Minsky, and various other people got together for the first time in Dartmouth College to talk about, building artificial intelligence. The book continues, and I'm not making this up. June the 18th, funnily enough, is International Panic Day. It's the day on which you're supposed to be panicking, which does seem fitting for the day on which we started to try and build intelligent machines.
That's wonderful. And you raise this about gender equity and inequity. You raised it sort of indirectly, but we've heard a lot about how AI systems are so biased, partly because of all of the data that they're being trained on, as you mentioned before. But what can we do to redress that?
No, it's not just, there are obvious biases in many of the data sets which they're trained upon, and you can once you realize that, you can try and correct those biases. But there's lots of other biases in there, right? There's only 20% of the people working in the field today are female, And that's the same as it was 20 years ago, despite all of the equity and inclusion efforts that have been made over the last 20 or 30 years. We have not moved the dial almost at all, sadly, on getting a better gender representation within the field. And there's plentiful evidence, all the evidence points to, if you want, good, robust product to be built, you need diverse teams. You need people with different perspectives. If you want to make sure the bias is addressed, you need people asking those questions. Why is it when they built the Apple Watch for the first time, it tracked nothing to do with female health? Right? If you want to track a woman's health, then her menstrual cycle is pretty important to understand, right? Your temperature goes up and down. Various other things in your body changes quite dramatically over the course of the month, which doesn't happen in men, right? So if you're trying to understand and improve the health of women, ignoring that is not satisfactory. And yet the first versions of the Apple Watch operating system did nothing to track women's health.
Yeah, I've been involved in building a lot of teams that do design and implementation and prototyping. Always try to get a very diverse group, because often the design biases are not willful.
No.
They're incidental, because to your great point, there's nobody in the room to say, I don't see myself in that. And that's a huge population that we should be addressing.
It is. And AI is going to be everywhere.
Yeah.
And half of everywhere is female.
Yeah. Yeah. So at the university here, I'm happy to say we have a pretty good gender balance. And that's something that we're really investing in maintaining. And the hope is, of course, that once the students graduate, they will go into environments where they can see equality of access and ability to comment and be heard. So I think that's a sort of longer term vision, but that's the university's very invested in supporting that.
That's great. And, I think we should always, be investing those sorts of efforts. But the problem starts really early if you look at it. If you look at the data, there isn't particularly good data, but the data that you can find shows that as soon as girls can start selecting at school, they start selecting against maths and STEM. And so by the time we get to university, it's already a small cohort, already feel somewhat disadvantaged, already feel outnumbered. I think really what we have to address is a deep societal bias that comes from media, it comes from Hollywood, it comes from parents, it comes from the cultural stereotypes that we have within our society. If you go to Spain, for example, women are much better represented in computer science. There was just, culture has just evolved in that way, and it was a more normal job for women to do, and so more women still do it. It just demonstrates that there's nothing inherent in why men should be doing this and women should be doing it. In Spain, it's as many women as men.
So I'm going to go back to a topic that we discussed earlier, science fiction and the importance of science fiction. Science fiction as inspiration, science fiction as a provocation.
Well, I think you can only build the future you can imagine. And what's the future I imagine? Well, it's the future I imagined as a young boy. I mean, I'm in artificial intelligence today because as a young boy, I read Isaac Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke. Those were my favorite authors. And they wrote about a future full of intelligent machines and robots. And I was very lucky to get my hands on a computer as a young boy and realizing, well, wait, we could build it on these machines. And that's something that would perhaps happen in my lifetime. And so as a young boy, I set myself the goal of saying, well, let's be someone who helps contribute to building that future. So I think, it's a wonderful example of how art, in this case science fiction, inspires us to build the sort of society. Other art forms, the novel, does also inspire us and warns us about the futures we might be building. And so I think art has a really important role to have those conversations and to inspire people and to direct people. And so it does worry me a little bit when I look at science fiction authors today, and and science fiction is very dystopian.
Yes.
That there's, I think, a much less romantic, much less optimistic view of the future. Not just in science fiction. I mean, I think in society as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
I think one doesn't want to sound like an old fogey and be nostalgic about the past, but back in the 70s and 80s, we were watching Star Trek and Star Wars. We were watching the Apollo moon landings,
Mm-hmm.
being inspired what we could do, what we could achieve if we set ourselves those goals. And you look today and you don't see that people are being so inspired by promise that science has to change our lives, to improve our lives. In fact, perhaps quite the opposite, sadly.
Oh, Star Trek, strong female roles. And even the dystopian movies like Alien, strong female roles. These were the things that I was watching, thinking, yes, we can make a difference, as women, as everybody, and make the world better. And of course, other gendered things. I got into AI because of knitting. I used to knit all the time.
Well, they have great computer programs you get in knitting instructions.
Absolutely, yeah.
And of course, the Jacquard loom
Yes.
that Ada Lovelace and Charles Babbage
Yes.
were building their mechanical computer was for weaving.
Yeah. Yeah, so, knitting, I am the operating
And the
system.
punch card.
Yes, I have
Dimensions
used
come from
punch cards.
those machines.
Yes. Yeah, so, again, AI for craft, AI for creativity, AI for inspiration, AI for, the future of building things that are better. And on that note, I'm going to ask you a question. If you could tell our students, because this is the first AI dedicated university, with a lot of very, very, very energetic, smart students, what would you tell them? Are there just a couple of things that you would tell them about them being what they take into the future that we would like to see?
I think the first thing I would tell them is I'm incredibly envious that they've turned up in a moment in history where I think a lot's going to happen. And there's a lot of tools and the AI is unfolding at an unprecedented rate. And that's the thing that surprised me most. I mean, I've been working now in AI for the best part of 40-something years. And I'm not actually that surprised in many respects at how the technology's unfolded, the place we've got to. But what has completely surprised me is the speed with which it's now unfolding. I never expected that we would be spending $1 billion a day on AI. That's a quarter of the world's R&D budget is being spent on AI. I never thought it would take over to that extent, and we would see such a scale of investment, which is of course driving the rate of change that we see. That you open a newspaper and there are multiple. I play this game with my daughter, which is I turn the car radio on when we get in the car, and it's how many minutes before they mention on the radio on the news channel AI, and it's measured in minutes. If not, normally it's the story that they're talking about when you turn the radio on. But it's like, if it's not that story, it's the next story. There's just so much happening, which is, really exciting. I think it's a really exciting time to be, riding this wave. So in that sense, I think they're really incredibly lucky. I feel quite envious that, I started, it was the beginning of the AI winter, as it became
Yes.
now and then. It wasn't respectable to say you do AI.
Right.
And now it's very respectable to say, you're doing AI, and it's really exciting time because there's so much investment, so much happening in the fields. In that sense, and there's so much you can do. The tools have reached a maturity that you can do much. And then the other thing I would encourage them to think about, and I'm starting to do this in my own research, which is there's plentiful places where it's going to make commercial sense. And those are the places where I think actually, as researchers, we don't have to put any time in. The commercial imperative will ensure that those things happen. That where we should be looking to apply AI is where other people won't, where there isn't that commercial incentive. So AI being used for social good, being used to help people with disability to accelerate science. I mean, that's why I'm actually putting a lot of my effort nowadays, is that it's a fantastic tool to look at the large data sets to help us accelerate the way that we go about doing science. And there, I mean, ultimately there is a commercial return from science, but it's much more longer term. And so I think actually, I encourage my students to put their efforts into those sorts of areas of AI that won't happen other than in universities.
And I think on that note, I want to say many thanks. The first is thank you for the books that you're writing and the upcoming one, which I look forward to reading, because I think you really do bridge between the deep science and the deep technology into the cultural imagination of what is and what's possible. And you make that accessible, and I think you inspire people to want to go into the deep tech and the deep science if they have that desire, because you're giving them the ability to imagine themselves as part of the conversation. So thank you for that, and look forward to the next book. But I also want to just say,
well, it's wonderful that books still have that important role.
Yeah.
I mean, libraries are my happy place.
Yeah.
And it's wonderful. Why do books? Why do we still write books? Because they do serve that purpose. Bringing together ideas and inspiring people, making people think. And I think that's they're a very useful unit of knowledge.
Yes.
And I don't see them, despite the attention-seeking apps that we have today that tap into, distract us like mad. It's wonderful to see that books, still have an important role to play.
Yes.
That they're important places to sit down, stop, and think. And
yes.
And so I'm a scientist first and foremost, and I do feel a bit of a fraud when I turn up at book festivals with my books and people say you're an author. But I guess now I've written 5, I probably could pretend to be an author. But first and foremost, I think of myself as a scientist who happens to be able to communicate. But that's an important skill. I mean, again, as a piece of advice for your students, learning to communicate is really important, because you have to sell your ideas to your fellow scientists and to the wider world. If at the end of the day you can't explain what you've done, there's really little point in having done it.
Yeah.
And so communication is actually one of the less appreciated but really fundamental skills to advance as a scientist. My students, many of whom are not actually native English speakers, I tell them, just read. Doesn't matter what you read, it will help you. You should be a vociferous reader. That will help you be a writer. Writing, of course, writing is a very good practice for being a good writer, but just reading, doesn't matter what you read, is actually something that's really important.
It's interesting. For 3 decades, I worked in Silicon Valley, not quite 3, but almost, hiring people, very, very, very smart people. One of the first things I would say to them is, you've been spending 70% of your time doing your science and 30% of your time doing other things. This is going to be 30 to 40% science and about 40% communication and skill around communication, learning how to bridge the gap between your knowledge and get into the mind and the passion of the other, and making that knowledge translation and transfer happen well. So I really believe in what you've said. I think that's so important as students go into their next roles as well, to have impact in the world in whatever role they take going forward.
It is, and they're actually quite different skill sets.
Yeah.
So to be a scientist, you've got to be quite focused and quite insular in many respects. You've got to be pretty dedicated to single-minded on trying to understand that problem. And then you've got to be able to step outside that and become quite an extrovert, not the introvert you had to be the scientist who just laser focused on that particular problem. You've got to be a bit more of an extrovert, someone who can step outside that and can relate to people and understand their misunderstandings and their misconceptions about what you're trying to explain to them. So it's an interesting set of skills that you need to put together to be an effective scientist.
Absolutely. And I just want to say, Toby, it's so good to see you after quite a while.
Well, let's not make it another 30 years before we
I
bump
hope,
into each other again.
before we write something together.
Yes. Write that next paper together.
Yes, absolutely. Over to you. But I also want to say, on behalf of the whole university and our library services, especially who invited and have hosted you, I want to say thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your insights and just giving us some nuggets that we can share with our students as well. Thank you.
Been a pleasure. Been a pleasure. Little historical fact. I did my PhD at what was at the time the only department of artificial intelligence in the world. Edinburgh University had the only department of artificial intelligence. So it's behoven upon me to come to what was the first university of artificial intelligence in the world.
And I did my PhD, my master's and PhD at Cambridge, master's at the second, which was Sussex.
Yes.
Which was set up to be their neat, we're scruffy.
Indeed, yes. Yeah. That's in many respects how we came together as being neat and scruffy.
Neat and scruffy.
Yes.
All right. Well, anyway, thank you so much, Toby.
Been a pleasure.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. Professor Toby Walsh, wonderful conversation. We look forward to hearing your feedback and getting comments from you. Thank you for being with us.